Please, if you haven't watched the introduction, the psychology of the pilot Checkride, or the rules of the Checkride part 1 and 2 videos, please exit now and watch them first. These videos follow a sequence and viewed otherwise will lessen its effect and may confuse you. So let's go with the first question. How quick do I have to answer when the examiner asks a question? Rule number 1, no rush. When the examiner asks you a question, take your time to think about the answer. The PTS does not require you to answer questions in a predetermined amount of time. When you hear the question, you can even count to 10 first, and then start the process of recalling or remembering. You're not graded on how quickly you can answer a question, rather, how accurate the answer is. Also, if you feel rushed or overwhelmed at any time, tell the examiner that you're going to take a break. Remember, this is a test, not a contest. Now, let me repeat that. It is only a test, not a contest. You see, when you rush, you will start falling behind because your mouth will be a lot faster than your mind. That's when confusion and second guessing begins, setting the stage for a possible disqualification, even though you may be knowledgeable. How long is the oral portion of the test? This happens to be a huge misconception. As you can see in this excerpt from the PTS introduction pages, once the oral portion begins, it is ongoing, since there is no formal division between the oral and skill portions of the practical test. And this includes the flight portion too. Will the examiner let me know if my answers are correct or incorrect every time? Even though the FAA requires that the examiner must give undivided attention to the applicant during the testing period, the examiner should not qualify your answers. Speaking of qualifying your answers, folks, this is probably the hardest thing to learn as an examiner, especially when you've been a flight instructor for as long as I've been. Proper evaluation requires that whether your answer is correct or incorrect, the examiner should not say anything. Just take notes, if required. The examiner should maintain a poker face throughout the test, and you know what I mean by that. Keep in mind that when you're answering a question, I may nod my head up and down. This action does not mean that I am agreeing with you or that your answer is correct. It is simply a way for me to acknowledge that I'm listening to you. Also, when you finish answering a question, I may say okay, and then move to another topic. That okay is just a figure of speech. Remember that both saying okay and nodding my head does not qualify your answers as being correct. And next is a follow-up question to that. Does the examiner take notes during the oral? This is a great question, by the way, because most pilots think that taking notes during a check ride is a bad thing. Let me explain why taking notes is okay, and the reason behind it. Number one, if the answer you give is incorrect, but in itself not disqualifying, the examiner should make a note of that. Number two, if you say something really good, the examiner may take a note also, so you can be praised at the debrief. Third, the examiner may remember to call the mechanic or get milk on the way home. You'll never know. And last, but not least, the main reason for taking notes is to prevent overlooking anything during the test and to ensure that you receive a thorough debrief at the conclusion of the practical test, during which the examiner will put on the instructor's hat and will make sure that the notes that were taken during the test are addressed. And this should be done whether you pass or not. Simply put, during an oral test, it's not fair and not in your best interest to let you know that you have made a mistake, because that's when the pressure may kick up another notch and reach red line. Consequently, a notice of disapproval may be issued, what I call induced stress disqualification. Believe it or not qualifying your answers is one of the most important rules of the evaluation process. In any event, if you see the examiner taking notes, it's a good thing, since it means that you're still in the game, because when a point is reached at which it becomes evident that you don't meet the FAA's acceptable knowledge standards, the examiner will tell you right then and there and will terminate the test. The examiner doesn't have to take notes to do that. Does the examiner randomly ask questions or a plan of action is used? I want you to know that a plan of action has been developed and will be used throughout the evaluation. All the questions and answers used on the ground oral portion of the test are written down, including the particular references. This eliminates confusion, undue delays, and allows for an even flow of the oral. It also helps tremendously in case there is a difference of opinion about an answer between you and the examiner. If I don't remember the answer to a question, can I research it in the references? If the evaluation is at the CFI level, references can be used whenever the CFI is teaching during the test. In any other evaluation, if you don't remember the answer, but you think you know the reference in which to find the answer, you may ask the examiner if you can look it up, providing that it is not a memory item and that you do find the answer in a reasonable amount of time, and depending on your overall performance and knowledge. This is to be judged in every individual case. The examiner may give you credit for it. Remember, nobody knows everything, including the examiner. The basic difference between you and the examiner is the examiner knows all the answers to all the questions that will be asked. That you can take to the bank. Will the examiner ask me questions based on the weak areas reflected on the knowledge test? Yes. That's the reason they're coded. And the examiner has a copy of the codes of the questions used in the knowledge test. One of the many purposes of the oral portion of the test is to make sure that the deficient areas found in the written test are evaluated. Remember, one of the required endorsements states that those questions were reviewed by the instructor and you prior to the test. Do I have to be on the lookout for trick questions? The FAA prohibits trick questions or to play any games when it comes to the quality of questions to be asked. All the questions should reflect only one answer. Always remember, this is a straightforward professional evaluation. You either know your stuff or you don't. Having said that, some of the questions and scenarios used throughout the test may have two answers. One, the safe thing to do. The other one, the legal thing to do. For instance, if the examiner asks you a question or creates a scenario that involves the operation of the aircraft during special VFR conditions, and your answer is, sir, I don't think I would request a special VFR. It is not safe to be flying so close to the ground with limited ceiling and visibilities. That is a safe answer, and it's optional. However, you still need to explain the legal aspect of the special VFR provision, even if you don't like it. That's mandatory. Keep that in mind. Will there be any questions that have to do with the examiner's experiences? This is a very important topic, so please listen carefully. The purpose of the Checkride is not for you to compete with the examiner experiences, because that would just not be fair. Questions about things that happened to the examiner in the past and how they were resolved should not be asked, simply because how would you know about them? That's unfair. What the examiner likes or dislikes, the way the examiner flies or teaches, and the personal experiences of the examiner have no bearing on the test. It is an FAA test. In other words, you don't have to satisfy the examiner, you have to satisfy the FAA through the examiner. You have to perform according to what the FAA wants you to know. Therefore, all the questions and scenarios must be based on the references used for putting together the applicable PTS for the certificate or rating sought. All you need to show is knowledge of the basics right out of the book. Because remember, if you apply the basics every time you fly, your chances of having an accident, an incident, or a violation are greatly reduced. Behind almost every accident, incident, or violation, you can find that some basics were ignored. Will the examiner ask me questions of all tasks? The examiner must ask questions about all the required tasks for the particular test. If we look at the latest edition of Advisory Circular AC 61-65E, Certification, Pilots and Flight and Ground Instructors, dated November 2905. On page 4, paragraph 8, it states that for elements of a maneuver or procedure on the practical test in which the applicants are required to be tested orally or by written questions, the PTS uses the words "the applicant exhibits knowledge of" or "the applicant exhibits instructional knowledge of" in the areas of each task noted as objective. The instructional knowledge applies to CFI only. I think this is very clear. There's really very clear. Do I have to be familiar with all the special emphasis areas? This area is probably one of the most misunderstood in any oral in-flight test. The PTS requires the examiner to evaluate the special emphasis areas that are found on the introduction pages of all the PTSs. Be familiar with them. Some of them may be tested through individual tasks, like stall spin awareness and runway incursion prevention. Others will be evaluated as an overall performance during the test, like positive aircraft control, visual scanning techniques, etc.